They were born beneath the floorboards during the darkest winter Ohio had ever seen. 3 boys entering the world, not with a cry, but with silence, as if they understood from the moment of birth that their lives were not meant to be ordinary, not meant to be known, not meant to be seen. This is not a ghost story. It is not folklore or legend, though it should be. This is the kind of story that families buried and governments ignored because the implications cut too deep into what we call reality. They were delivered in secret beneath a Quaker meeting house doubling as a station on the Underground Railroad, while dogs howled in the distance and bounty hunters closed in. Their mother Ruth had no last name, no history that anyone could verify, and when she spoke it was always with knowledge that went beyond what a person should know. She predicted the names of the men who would betray the station before they arrived. She warned of bad food before it spoiled. She spoke a language no one could place but that sounded like it came from before the world was made. When the boys were born, she whispered to them in that same voice, and they listened. She died an hour later. Her last words to the woman who helped deliver them were, "They will always know what others hide. Take care of them, but never think they are like other children." From that moment on, the town of Cedar Mills was never the same. The Quakers took in the children, raised them in silence and secrecy, naming them Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac. But it didn't take long for the whispers to begin. At first, it was small things. They never cried at night. They turned their heads in perfect unison when strangers arrived. They would not look at you if you lied even a little. They would stare into your eyes until you couldn't bear it. And when they did, something inside you moved, shifted, felt exposed. This was no ordinary intuition. This was something else. And as they grew, their abilities deepened, and so did the fear, not of what they might become, but of what they already were. Because some truths are not buried for being false. They are buried because they are too powerful to be allowed in the light. By the time the boys were 3, Cedar Mills was no longer a town. It was a secret. The Triplets had become something between myth and surveillance, their quiet presence reshaping how people behaved, how they spoke, how they thought. Imagine living in a place where a child could read your guilt before you knew it was there, where your private sins echoed in the eyes of boys too young to know how the world works. And yet they did. They always did. Mothers confessed infidelities without being asked. Men returned stolen goods before anyone accused them, and those who refused to change simply left, unable to withstand the weight of being seen. No one ever said what the boys were. Not allowed. They weren't witches, not in the Puritan sense. They weren't prophets either. But when one of them looked at you with that stillness that wasn't natural for a child and said, "Don't go," you stayed, and if you didn't, something happened. The first man to ignore their warning was found days later, face down in the Muskingum River, his hands bound with wire he never owned. The second never made it out of town. His horse returned alone. His body was never recovered. Coincidence, maybe. But in a town where coincidences had patterns, no one dared pretend anymore. The Quakers kept meticulous records. But none of this was written. It was passed in glances, in the way an elder's voice would falter when the boys entered a room. In the sudden silences that followed their laughter. Not because the sound was strange, but because it was rare. They didn't play. They didn't run or chase or cry when they were scolded. They simply observed and whispered, always the 3 of them, close together, heads tilted in the same direction, murmuring in that flowing ancient language no one had taught them. Some nights, when the wind cut hard through the trees, people claimed they could hear the whispers echo through the floorboards of the meeting house. like wind through the bones of something that should have never been disturbed. And in those moments, even the bravest men locked their doors, lit candles, and prayed. Not because they feared the boys, but because something had changed since their birth. The rules of the world had shifted, and no one could say when or if they'd shift back. By the winter of 1859, it became clear these were not children that could be raised in any ordinary way. They learned too quickly, spoke too precisely, and watched everything with eyes that never blinked at the wrong moment. When other children cried at night, they were silent. When others feared the dark, they walked toward it. When a fire broke out in the eastern barn, Caleb was already outside, pointing at the source before the first flame touched the roof. Ezra followed a man into town once, without speaking a word, just walking 3 steps behind him for over a mile. When the man arrived at the tavern, he confessed to stealing from the meeting house donations. No one had accused him, no one had known, except the boy. It wasn't just knowing things. It was how they moved in the world, like they'd seen it before, like they remembered things they shouldn't know. Samuel Whitmore stopped asking questions when he found the boys in the cemetery one morning, standing in perfect silence around a grave that had no marker. He didn't even know the grave existed. Later he'd learn it belonged to a woman buried in 1792, executed for witchcraft before Ohio was even a state. How did they know? What were they remembering? One night, Dr. Harrison brought them a deck of cards, a simple test of memory and pattern recognition. They laid them out, sorted them by shape, color, and age of the wood. Not paint wood. They could tell which cards had been handled by which person, and how recently. They knew which had touched fire, which had been near sickness, which had lied. The doctor wrote only one sentence that night in his journal. They are seeing through more than eyes. The town changed around them. Doors were reinforced. Mirrors were turned toward walls. Books were burned without explanation. Not because anyone feared the boys directly, but because the boys revealed what everyone else wanted hidden, and in a place built on silence that was more dangerous than fire. People whispered that the triplets were the price paid for years of quiet sins, that they were the consequence of secrets buried under Quaker simplicity. And maybe they were, because the longer they lived, the more the world twisted around them, like reality itself was adjusting to their presence. And soon, even those who loved them began to wonder what exactly had been born in that basement. The spring of 1860 brought warmth to the fields of Cedar Mills. But no such thaw reached the hearts of those raising the boys. By now, something had changed, not in the triplets themselves, but in the air around them. It was subtle at first. Chickens refusing to enter the path where the boys walked, dogs growling low whenever the boys made eye contact, infants crying the moment they were brought near. But then it grew stranger. Clocks began to stop when all 3 boys entered a room together. Photographic plates exposed indoors showed triple smudges of light where no source could be identified. More than one visitor complained of sharp headaches or nosebleeds after spending too long near the children. And yet through it all, the boys remained calm, polite, silent when expected, but watching, always watching. Samuel Whitmore began a new journal, separate from the community log. Its cover bore no title, only the words carved into the inside spine. Witness what cannot be named. The entries began to track what he called proximity phenomena. Visitors who forgot their own names after looking into the boys' eyes, cattle miscarrying when the triplets were nearby, an entire field of corn rotting from the inside overnight. Even Dr. Harrison, the town's most rational mind, could no longer maintain clinical distance. He described the boys now as psychic tripwires, entities who seemed to trigger the unraveling of others. They weren't malicious. They didn't cause it directly. But their presence revealed things that had been buried. Guilt, shame, falsehood, secrets. One teacher who had come to tutor them returned home after only 3 sessions and threw herself down a well. Her husband claimed she had never spoken of the boys directly, but had whispered over and over in the days before her death, "They know what I did." And yet, for all their strangeness, the boys remained deeply bonded to each other. They slept in a triangle, heads touching at the center. They spoke their flowing liquid language in low murmurs. They drew symbols in the dirt that no one could read, yet which reappeared days later in burnt patches across nearby fields. They were a closed circuit of knowing, a perfect mirror of something not quite human, but still growing, still changing, still waiting for something no one else could see. By midsummer of 1860, the triplets had begun to dream together. That's what Martha Whitmore called it, not sleepwalking, not night terrors, not imagination, dreaming together. They would rise from their shared bed just before midnight, always at the same time, and walk barefoot into the fields beyond the meeting house. No sound, no expression, no resistance when followed. But they never acknowledged anyone watching them, never flinched when their names were called. They walked as if guided, as if pulled by some gravity that existed only for them. Each night they walked the same path, through the tall grass to the same cluster of sycamore trees, and there, without speaking, they would kneel in a triangle and begin drawing into the dirt. Martha followed once and wrote in her journal that what she saw made her knees go weak. The boys had etched a perfect geometric symbol, circles inside triangles, inside lines that never touched, and were repeating a phrase in their strange mother tongue, over and over, in unison, eyes closed, as if praying to something buried beneath the soil. Dr. Harrison was summoned and observed the ritual 3 nights in a row. His notes stopped on the 4th. He left town without explanation. Weeks later, a letter arrived for Samuel Whitmore from the doctor, postmarked from Philadelphia. "The boys are not dreaming," the letter said. "They are remembering." The next morning, Samuel ordered the field sealed off, but the triplets simply chose another spot, a burned-out barn 2 miles away, then a hollow beneath a ridge, then a dry creek bed, each location chosen with absolute precision, each time the same ritual, same symbols, same chanting, same silence. It became clear that geography itself was part of the pattern, that the boys were mapping something no adult could understand, something older than the town, older than the church, perhaps older. By the fall of 1860, something else began to change, not just in the triplets, but in the people around them. Fear had taken root in Cedar Mills, but it wasn't loud. It wasn't torches and pitchforks. It was quieter than that, colder. People who once adored the boys now crossed the street to avoid them. Whispers began to follow them like shadows, not accusations, but something worse, questions with no answers. What are they? Where do they come from? And why are they here? Even the most faithful Quakers, those sworn to pacifism and equality, began locking their doors at night. Not because of slave catchers, but because they didn't trust what might be walking in their own fields. Samuel Whitmore remained publicly committed to protecting the boys, but even he had started sleeping with a Bible clutched to his chest. Martha wrote that his hands trembled more often now, and he no longer prayed with his eyes closed. What unsettled them most wasn't the triplets' silence. It was their knowing, the way they watched you when you lied to yourself, not just to others, but to yourself. The way they tilted their heads when you claimed everything was fine, when your marriage was breaking, when your son had left home in anger, when your faith had gone cold in the middle of the night. They saw that. They heard it inside you, and they didn't flinch. They didn't pity. They didn't blink. They just knew. And then they would whisper to each other, in that flowing language like water over stone, not loud, but not ignorable. And everyone in town knew the whispers weren't gossip. They were records, transcripts, a ledger of the human soul being kept by three small boys who had no business knowing so much. One evening, a preacher from Columbus arrived unannounced. He'd heard the stories, and he came with questions masked as sermons. He demanded to see the boys, to lay hands on them, to Casto asked. The winter of 1861 dragged across Cedar Mills like a shroud soaked in dread, not because of snow or starvation, but because of silence. The kind of silence that settles over a town when everyone senses something is watching, but no one agrees on what it is. The triplets were now 5 years old enough to walk alone, to speak clearly, to understand instructions, but they needed none. They moved through the village like ghosts wearing the skin of boys. No schoolhouse could hold them, no church could teach them, because they already knew what others only pretended to believe. They still whispered, always in unison, always in that strange, undulating language no one could place on any map or ancient scroll. Dr. Harrison tried to record it once, but the phonetic symbols twisted in his notebook until he vomited on the page and tore it out in terror. He never tried again, and when asked why, all he said was, "It isn't a language you learn. It's one you remember." By now, the boys could do more than detect lies. They could unmake them. A man would speak a falsehood, even a small one, and suddenly forget what lie he had just told, as if the memory of deception had been erased before it ever finished forming. People began forgetting their sins in front of them, not through confession, but through erasure. The boys wiped shame clean, not mercifully, but with a force that left their victims hollow. The local banker was found weeping in the middle of the night beneath the meeting house steps. He had confessed to no one, but everyone knew the embezzled funds had vanished the same week. He stared too long into Isaac's eyes. A woman named Eleanor, once proud and dignified, now walked with her head lowered. After one interaction with the boys, she could no longer speak her husband's name without choking on tears. No one knew what they'd seen, but Eleanor never touched a Bible again. Spring came to Cedar Mills without color. The birds returned, but sang no songs near the meeting house. The river thawed, but its current flowed slower past the Quaker land, as if reluctant. Even the wind seemed to hush when it passed the place where Ruth had died and her sons had begun to awaken. By now, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac had become a problem no one could speak about, and yet everyone feared they were still children in form. Small hands, soft faces, curious eyes, but behind their gazes was something ageless. Not ancient, ageless, like time never touched them. Like the ticking clock was something they simply chose not to obey. Their predictions had become dangerous, not because they were wrong, but because they were never wrong. They predicted a house fire 3 days before it devoured the Holloway family's barn. They predicted the death of Reverend Calhoun's wife, by name, date, and cause, before she even knew she was sick. And most disturbing, they predicted the death of a child that hadn't even been conceived yet, a miscarriage that shattered a young couple whose joy had barely begun to form. The townspeople began avoiding them, not out of hatred, but out of terror. Because once you heard what the boys said, you couldn't unhear it. They gave no comfort, only certainty. When a man named Elias Dobbins came through Cedar Mills asking questions about a missing sister, the boys gathered around him like wolves around a wounded deer. They asked no questions, only stared, and then Caleb said one sentence. "She drowned with her hands bound, 3 days before your search began." Elias collapsed where he stood. The body was recovered a week later, exactly where the boy had described. It was no longer theory, no longer mystery. It was something worse. It was reality confirmed by beings too young to spell their own names, yet able to recite the crimes of strangers By summer of 1862, Cedar Mills was no longer just a quiet village along the Underground Railroad. It was something else entirely, something watched, something marked. The triplets, now 6 years old, no longer behaved like boys raised by the community. They spoke less to others and more to one another, always in that language no one could trace. No dialect, no regional influence, just sounds like murmuring water over bone. They didn't walk. They moved with intent, always together, always aware. They knew who was coming before a single hoofprint touched the road. They whispered names before the letters had ever been written, and then they began drawing symbols, figures, circles with eyes at their centers, lines that resembled routes across the state, but didn't match any known maps. They drew with sticks in dirt, with charcoal on stone, with fingers on fogged windows. Martha Whitmore, who had once held them as infants, now kept her distance. Her journal from that time reveals a chilling shift. She wrote, "They do not age like others. They do not laugh or cry as they once did. There is calculation in them now, something preparing." The turning point came with a visitor named Henry Langston, a conductor from the Maryland line. Trusted by every network in the system, he had saved dozens, risked everything. But the moment he stepped foot on Quaker soil, the triplets froze, their bodies rigid, eyes locked on him. As he greeted Samuel with a wide grin, the boys huddled in a corner and whispered for 5 full minutes. No one moved, and then Ezra turned and said softly, "He speaks the truth with his mouth, but his heart hides a knife." The room went silent. Samuel tried to laugh it off, to reason with the boys, but they wouldn't let Langston near the basement. That night, Langston vanished. 2 days later, a safe house in Zanesville was raided. 6 freedom seekers T. Autumn of 1862 came cold and early. The trees around Cedar Mills turned black before they turned red, and with them came the whispers, louder than before. This time, not just about the boys, but about what they were attracting. Animals had begun to vanish. First, the livestock. 3 goats from the northern farm, 2 horses from the miller's stable. Then the wild ones, ravens, stopped flying overhead. Foxes disappeared from the forest's edge. Even the dogs grew restless, barking at nothing, refusing to enter the meeting house. But it wasn't nothing. It was them. The triplets had changed. They didn't eat like before, didn't sleep in beds. They slept on the floor in the basement where they were born, always together, always in the same position. Their breathing synchronized, their bodies perfectly still. Then came the night of October 3rd. It started like any other. Quiet, brittle, the moon half hidden behind gauze-thin clouds. But around midnight, every candle in the village blew out at once. Every lamp flickered, and a sound began to rise. Low at first, like wind in a coffin, then sharper, layered, a hum inside the skull, a sound no one could trace but everyone heard. That was when people saw them, not the boys, but the others. Figures in the fields, 7 of them, tall, thin, unmoving, draped in what looked like wet cloth that hung heavy in the still night air. Their faces were wrong, blank like masks carved from bone. No eyes, no mouths, just presence. Martha saw them first, then the baker's wife, then the man who ran the post. All different directions, but all described the same thing. They didn't speak, they just pointed, all 7 of them, toward the basement of the meeting house. Inside, the boys were awake, sitting upright, eyes open wide, staring at the ceiling, mouths closed, but still whispering. That sound, that hum, was coming from them. Samuel rushed inside with a lantern, demanded to know what was happening. Ezra looked at him and said one sentence: "They've come to see if we remember." No one slept that night, and by morning, the figures were gone. But in the dirt outside the meeting house were 7 perfect footprints, deeper than any human could make, pressed into stone like flesh had never touched the earth. Only wait. From that night forward, the boys were never treated as children again. They were spoken to carefully, avoided in daylight, feared in silence. Because what the town now understood was this: the triplets were not just sensitive to truth. They were tied to something ancient, something that doesn't die, doesn't age, only watches. and waits. The weight of that night settled over Cedar Mills like a shadow that never lifted. Whispers turned to rumors, and rumors grew into fear that clung to every heart. No one dared speak openly about the 7 silent figures, or what remembering truly meant. But all knew something deeper had been awakened. The triplets began to change in ways that defied explanation. Their eyes, once dark and knowing, now gleamed with an unearthly sheen. They no longer played or laughed. Their voices, when heard, were colder, more distant. The soft flowing language Ruth had taught them was replaced with sharp, guttural sounds that cut through the silence like knives. Neighbors who crossed their path spoke of feeling chills running down their spines, as if the boys carried a storm inside them. Samuel Whitmore wrestled with the growing gulf between his love for the boys and the unnatural presence that surrounded them. He recorded in a letter that he felt the boys carried the burden of knowledge not meant for human minds, the kind that fractures the soul. He feared what that knowledge might eventually demand from them and from those who protected them. By winter of 1862, the Underground Railroad itself was under siege. Federal raids intensified, and every safe house became a trap waiting to snap shut. Yet, the triplets' silent vigilance became the community's final shield. Their uncanny ability to detect betrayal or danger kept the most precious secret safe. But the price was clear. The boys were slowly becoming something else. Not children, not human. They began to vanish for hours at a time, often found wandering the woods at night, whispering to shadows that did not reply. Sometimes they were found standing by the riverbank, eyes fixed on the dark waters, as if listening for voices only they could hear. The townsfolk spoke quietly of curses, of ancient pacts made under desperate circumstances, and of the toll take. When innocence collides with forbidden knowledge. But there was no turning back, because those boys were born into a world where truth was a weapon, and silence their only protection. And now I ask you, as you stand at this crossroad in the story, type the words, "I see beyond the veil," twice in the comments below. Lock these truths deep within yourself, because the path ahead is darker, and only those who choose to walk it will ever understand what lies beneath. Prepare yourself to fall further, into the abyss of secrets, into the shadow of the triplets. As the years slipped by, the triplets grew in stature, but shrank from the world around them. Their minds stretched beyond the limits of ordinary children, their burden heavier than any man could bear. No one outside the protective circle of the Quaker community knew what horrors the boys had glimpsed, what whispered truths had seeped into their minds. The boys no longer spoke in that strange language. Their communication was silent, a shared understanding, like the flicker of a candle in a dark room, fragile yet unbreakable. The community began to notice a pattern in their disappearances. They would vanish just before a tragedy, only to reappear after the dust settled, their eyes cold and unreadable. No laughter, no warmth, only the heavy knowledge of things no child should ever know. It was during one such disappearance that a grim event unfolded. The boys had warned Samuel of a betrayal within the ranks of the Underground Railroad. A trusted conductor had been compromised. An informant feeding slave catchers information. When the betrayal became public, the shock rippled through the network. But the triplets had been right. The man was arrested. Yet, the damage was done. Several freedom seekers had been captured and returned to bondage, their fate sealed by the traitor's greed. The boys never celebrated their accuracy. Instead, they retreated further into themselves. their faces masks of sorrow and silent rage. Dr. Harrison, who had once marveled at their gifts, wrote in his final notes that he feared these children were evolving into something beyond human comprehension, that their growing powers were intertwined with an ancient darkness lurking beneath the surface of the world. He warned that such knowledge would consume them, body and soul. The people of Cedar Mills whispered of spirits, of demons disguised in child's form, of a curse that had descended on the community the night Ruth gave birth in that hidden basement. And yet, no one dared reject the boys. They were their shield and their doom. The shadows lengthened over Ohio as civil war ravaged the land. The triplets sensed the chaos to come, their silent cries echoing the impending storm. Their fate was no longer just about survival. It was about what they would become in a world burning alive with hatred and violence. Are you ready to see the truth behind their legacy? Because what you think you know is only the beginning. The outbreak of war shattered the fragile calm that had gripped Cedar Mills. The triplets, now 7 years old, found themselves caught in a maelstrom of violence far beyond their young minds. Yet their gifts intensified, their senses piercing deeper into the fabric of human despair and betrayal. Each day brought new horrors that no child should witness. The bodies of soldiers returned broken and bloodied, families torn apart by loss and grief. The boys' eyes mirrored a darkness growing within them, a reflection of the suffering surrounding their small town. The Underground Railroad became more perilous, the stakes higher than ever before. The triplets' role shifted from passive observers to active sentinels, their uncanny abilities the last line of defense against spies, traitors, and hunters. They could smell fear before it settled in the air. They could sense the faintest flicker of deceit, the tiniest heartbeat of malice. And yet, this knowledge isolated them further. No other children could understand their burden. No adult could truly comfort them. Their whispered language grew more urgent, more desperate, but it remained a secret locked away from the world. One night, during a brutal winter storm, the triplets disappeared for 3 days. The town searched frantically, fearing the worst. When they returned, their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. They refused to speak of where they had been or what they had seen. But from that day on, a coldness settled in their souls, a chilling reminder of the darkness they had touched. Rumors began to swirl among the townsfolk, whispers of a pact forged in shadows, of knowledge gained at a terrible cost, of a curse that bound the boys to a fate none could escape. Samuel Whitmore, burdened by guilt and fear, tried to shield them from the outside world, but the boys' powers were growing beyond control. They could sense death before it happened, feel the weight of secrets buried deep in men's hearts, predict betrayals that shattered families and friendships. The line between blessing and curse blurred, and with every passing day, the triplets seemed less like children and more like oracles of doom. Now, before we go further, I want you to lock this knowledge in your mind. Type in the comments below. Eyes see all. Silence speaks. Then type it again. This is more than a phrase. It is a key to awaken your own awareness, to understand the depths we are about to explore. Because what lies ahead is not for the faint of heart. It is a descent into forbidden truths that will change the way you see the world forever. After their mysterious disappearance, the triplets' connection to the unseen world only deepened. They spoke less, their whispered language turning into something almost ritualistic. Their eyes held a knowing far beyond human understanding, as if they were no longer bound by time or space. Local adults began to notice strange occurrences around the meeting house. At night, Faint lights flickered beneath the floorboards. Shadows moved without source. Unexplainable sounds echoed through the empty halls. Some whispered that the boys had become conduits for something ancient and dark, that their birth had awakened forces long buried beneath Ohio soil, a hidden legacy tied to secrets older than the country itself. The triplets' strange abilities escalated beyond lie detection and sensing danger. They began to demonstrate knowledge of events before they happened, visions that came unbidden and uncontrollable. Samuel Whitmore recorded in his private journal the terror in their eyes when these visions gripped them. Faces of strangers twisted in agony, voices crying out from beyond. One chilling incident involved a visiting stranger who came seeking the boys' aid. Without being told a single word, the triplets identified the man's darkest sins and predicted his downfall. Days later, the man disappeared without a trace, leaving only rumors of foul play and supernatural intervention. The boys' growing powers attracted attention beyond Cedar Mills. Whispers reached abolitionist networks and government agents alike. Some sought to protect them, fearing the consequences if such knowledge fell into the wrong hands. Others feared the boys as dangerous anomalies, threats to the established order. Isolation became their prison. Even those who raised them began to fear the truth behind their abilities. Their caretakers noticed the toll on the boys' fragile minds. Nightmares that left them screaming. The night, unexplained illnesses, and a coldness in their gaze that never faded. The community grappled with a terrible question. Were these children gifted or cursed? Were they heralds of salvation or harbingers of doom? The answers lay buried beneath layers of silence and fear, waiting for the day when the world was ready to confront the macabre mystery that began in that cold Ohio basement in 1856. The Civil War's shadow stretched over Cedar Mills, turning the quiet town into a crucible of fear and uncertainty. The triplets, now growing boys, became ever more entwined with the currents of conflict raging beyond their small world. Their visions grew darker, filled with images of bloodshed and betrayal that chilled even the steeliest hearts. Samuel Whitmore wrote of nights when the boys would suddenly awaken, eyes wide and shimmering with terror. They would whisper warnings in their strange language, sometimes pointing toward distant horizons as if seeing battles yet to come. Their empathy for suffering extended beyond the living to the dead, their voices carrying laments for those lost in the chaos. Local soldiers and escaped slaves alike sought the boys' guidance, desperate to glean whatever fragment of hope or warning they might offer. But the triplets' knowledge was not a blessing, but a curse. Each revelation bore the weight of inevitability, a cruel reminder that some fates could not be changed. Their uncanny ability to foresee death became a source of anguish. Parents, friends, and freedom seekers alike feared to approach them, knowing their gaze would strip away lies and illusions. The boys bore their knowledge like a cross, isolated by their unbearable awareness of humanity's darkest impulses. One fateful summer day, the triplets fell silent for hours. When they finally spoke, their voices trembled with a prophecy so harrowing it seemed to drain the life from the room. They foretold of a betrayal so deep it would shatter the fragile hope of freedom for many, a warning no one wanted to hear, but one that Samuel Whitmore knew he could not ignore. The boys urged the community to prepare, to brace for the coming storm. But no amount of readiness could shield them from what lay ahead. The secrets the triplets carried were not merely gifts, but chains, links binding them to a destiny, shaped by forces beyond human control. As war tightened its grip on Ohio, the line between friend and foe blurred, and the triplets, haunted by visions of blood and shadows, stood as both guardians and prisoners of a knowledge that threatened to consume them whole. The days grew darker with every passing month as the war raged on, transforming the very fabric of Cedar Mills. The triplets' strange abilities became both a beacon and a curse, attracting those desperate for truth and repelling those afraid of it. Their eyes, once bright with childlike curiosity, now carried a weight far beyond their years, a burden carved from sorrow and endless secrets. Samuel Whitmore documented the growing strain on the boys' spirits, noting how their whispered language became more urgent, more fractured. They spoke of shadows moving through the town, spies, informants, enemies disguised in friendly faces. The triplets' knowing looks could pierce through masks of loyalty and deceit alike, unsettling even the most steadfast Quakers. The community found itself trapped in a web of suspicion. Neighbors glanced warily at each other, fearing the silent judgment of the triplets' penetrating gaze. Trust began to erode, replaced by a cold unease that crept into every conversation and every glance. At night, the boys huddled close, their murmurs echoing through the cold meeting house basement. They spoke of betrayals that had not yet come to pass, names whispered in the shadows, men and women who would bring ruin upon the Underground Railroad. Their warnings were cryptic but chillingly precise, as if the boys could read the dark threads weaving through the future. And then, the moment came when Cedar Mills was tested beyond all hope. A new informant had infiltrated their ranks, a shadow slipping unseen into the heart of the community. The triplets' distress was palpable, their synchronized whispers rising in frantic urgency. But the betrayal cut deeper than anyone anticipated, unraveling decades of careful secrecy in a single night. The aftermath left scars that would never fully heal. The Underground Railroad station was compromised, lives were lost, and trust shattered into shards. Yet, amid the ruin, the triplets remained, silent sentinels bearing the unbearable weight of forbidden knowledge. Their eyes, now dark pools of grief and understanding, held the terrible truth. The war was far from over, and their journey into the depths of darkness was just beginning. Before we go deeper, comment twice below the phrase, "The shadows reveal the truth," to claim your place in this hidden world and unlock the next layer of awareness with me.
The betrayal that shattered Cedar Mills was not just a local tragedy. It was a signal of something far more sinister. The war had unleashed forces beyond the clash of armies, forces that thrived on deception, fear, and control. The triplets, once mere children, had become unwitting conduits for a deeper, darker knowledge that seeped from the heart of the conflict itself. Their abilities, once regarded as a strange gift, began to reveal an even more terrifying dimension. They did not just sense lies or emotional distress anymore. They began perceiving the invisible networks of power manipulating lives from the shadows. The whispers of corruption threading through political halls, military commands, and even religious sanctuaries. Samuel Whitmore and the community struggled to comprehend this new reality. The boys' silent warnings turned into haunting visions, fragments of conversations not spoken aloud, secrets buried beneath layers of lies. The triplets would stare into space, their eyes glazed as if watching something no one else could see. And then, without warning, they would deliver truths that chilled those who heard them. They spoke of men whose faces were never seen, but whose hands moved entire cities like pieces on a chessboard. They spoke of rituals conducted in hidden rooms, where allegiance was bought and souls were bartered. The boys' knowledge transcended the borders of the Underground Railroad, touching the darkest corners of American power and corruption. This knowledge isolated the triplets further. Even the Quaker families who raised them began to fear what the boys knew. Conversations hushed when the triplets entered the room, and eyes quickly turned away. What was once a tight-knit community began to fracture under the weight of secrets too dangerous to bear. Yet the triplets pressed on, driven by an unspoken purpose. They knew they were destined to become something. The Civil War tore through the nation. but its shadows reached even deeper into the souls of those caught in its grasp. The triplets, now approaching their 7th year, bore the weight of a world unraveling around them. Their powers, once mere curiosities, had become burdens heavy enough to crush the strongest of men. They no longer merely sensed betrayal or danger. They felt the very pulse of violence as it rippled through the land. From battlefields stained with blood to secret councils plotting in darkened rooms, the triplets' awareness expanded beyond human limits. They knew of deaths yet to come, of alliances forged in deceit, and of destinies that would be forever altered by unseen hands. But this terrible knowledge came at a cost. The boys grew silent, withdrawn, haunted by the faces of those lost and the horrors their visions revealed. The community watched helplessly as the boys became shadows of themselves, trapped in a world where truth was both a weapon and a curse. In the final months before their disappearance, the triplets spoke rarely but always in that strange, flowing language, words that seemed to carry a power beyond comprehension, as if summoning forces from realms hidden to all but them. Then one cold autumn night, without warning or explanation, Caleb, Ezra, and Isaac vanished from Cedar Mills. No trace was ever found, no whisper, no sign, no farewell. Theories abound. Some say they were taken by forces beyond this world, others that they chose exile to protect secrets too dangerous to reveal. But the truth remains buried in silence, locked away with the darkest chapters of American history. What is certain is this: the triplets' story is not merely one of strange children or forgotten miracles. It is a chilling reminder that beneath the surface of the known world lies a hidden reality, a reality ruled by shadows, where power corrupts, knowledge isolates,